Okay, great. Welcome everyone back again. Can we get to your attention? Thank you. So this panel is about investing in place, from microfinance to community reinvestment funds. And your moderator is the one and only Kate Storr. She's the co-founder and managing director. And there's a bio here, but I don't want to talk about the bio from here. So she is our fearless leader of Architecture for Humanity. And what's amazing is she has a background in journalism. That's how she originally started. But she has gone through, I would say, doing a lot of paradigm shifts in how you're approaching the whole space that we're talking about here. And specifically to this topic that I would say, one of the pioneers in getting community in construction finance to people in Haiti, which the banks don't want to touch. They just don't want to talk to those kind of lenders. And so it's really amazing that what Kate is sort of re-questioning how things are and opening new doors and avenues to further the design in better design in many aspects. So that's Kate Storr for you, and she is going to take it from here and introduce the panel. And thank you.
There you go. All right. This is my favorite panel, and I'm super pleased to be here. We're going to be pushing some boundaries here, talking with people who are doing some very, very innovative work in providing access to construction finance. Personally, I think that this is the most important topic that we're talking about today. All of those projects that happen out there would not happen if they didn't have some support or passion. But imagine if they were also funded and financed. And imagine if all of the talent that we had in this room could also access a pool of financing. So my goal here is to get you all acquainted with some of the innovative structures that are coming down the pike. We have a wonderful set of panelists here. And I'm going to start from right to left with Patrick Kelly, who's here with Habitat for Humanity. He's been working on microfinance and housing. He's going to tell us a little bit about the innovative work that they're doing there that's changing models in emerging markets. We have Henry Lowe, who's an associate at Carl Mackey Power and Ross. He's an attorney who structures housing finance here in America, and we're going to talk about how he's structuring deals in low-income communities, some of the changes that are down the road now that we don't have redevelopment agencies due to budget cuts. We have Mitch Nedegovich, and Mitch, although it says here that he's with the President Cattleman's Mortgage and Investment Corporation, which he is also a consultant with Shorebank International, and he's been working to advise banks, mostly in emerging markets, and how they can build their capacity to provide access to construction financing. And then finally, we have Dan Miller, and he's here to talk about what I think is going to be an amazing new platform. It takes some of the ideas of crowdsourced funding and applies it to the real estate investment industry. So we're going to have them to give about a 5-minute sort of introduction to their work, and then we're going to open the floor to questions from you in sort of a moderated discussion. I encourage you, raise your hand, pipe up. It's just an amazing opportunity to have some of these guys in this room and hear what they're working on. So let's start. Let's start with you, Patrick. Yeah, come on up. Trapped. There you go.
Thank you, Kate, and we are very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting us at Habitat for Humanity. So I am, again, with Habitat for Humanity International. I'm our Director of Market Development and Housing Finance, and I'm going to share just a little bit about our MicroBuild fund that closed this year, and we're very excited about that. And I was asked to send in a graphic, and so I submitted this cartoon, one because I like cartoons, but it is also, I think, representative of what has forced us as Habitat for Humanity to really think creatively. I think most of you are probably familiar with our work in the United States, where we build homes for people, we finance them directly with a Habitat mortgage. And we've seen that that generally is not making a contribution to the housing deficit that we see globally, particularly with the rapid urbanization that is happening in the developing part of the world. So this concept of housing microfinance and this fund to propel that are really the fruit of our thinking creatively about how to engage with markets and try to find local market actors who can be a part of the solution for affordable housing. So I've spent a lot of time on this, but I'm going to give you guys just a real quick glance. This is really viewing this thing that we're trying to drive forward with this fund, housing microfinance, through a lens of market failure. So for mortgage markets to work, generally speaking, two things need to be in place for them. They need that left cross-section to be there, which is a formal, documented source of income, generally from a formal market job. And then that right cross-section, which is formal, generally freehold title. And so when those two things are in place, property, housing can be mortgaged relatively well. But for those two things to be in place, generally that restricts one to working only with the higher income populations, and particularly in countries like Ghana, Cambodia, places where we really struggle with property rights, and where penetration of financial markets are incredibly shallow, and where most people work in the informal economy. So it's really, the whole idea of housing microfinance, the way we're thinking about it, is it's really sort of housing from the bottom up. How do we work with these, sort of the masses, really? How do we create housing solutions for them in this informal economy space where 98% of housing in Tanzania is acquired through the informal market? 98%. The Philippines, it's 93%. So those are massive amounts of people that their housing process, they think of it's a verb, and it's something that they do over time. So how do we make that better? How do we make that more effective? And how do we empower communities to do that well? So I'll leave it at that. This is back to if we need to during the Q&A. But so what we've done to push this forward, we've seen that there's a lack of this housing microfinance concept. There's massive demand. This microfinance thing, which many of you I'm sure have heard of, we have done some studies, and others have done studies. They generally show that about 30% of proceeds for micro-enterprise, so small businesses, is actually being used for housing. So people are taking their small business loan and they're actually repairing their roof with it. So yet at the same time, only 2%, or sometimes they estimate 3%, I think that's very generous, of those loans or financial services are intended for housing. So we think there's a great opportunity to actually design those services to meet the housing needs of people, which are using it for anyway. One thing that's mentioned as a real lack is institutions, people in savings and credit and remittances services don't know how to design housing products. The other thing that's lacking is capital. The average investment in the growth of microfinance is about a 2-year tenor of capital, whereas even housing microfinance tends to be about 2.5, 3 years long. So basically there's a real mismatch of funding to really propel this market forward. So here's the fund, a little stylized version of it. It's a $100 million fund. We've closed out $50 million. We've gotten a large source of capital from the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which we're very happy about. The fund is owned. We are the majority owners, Habitat for Humanity International, so we're the fund sponsor in a sense. We have other social investors who make up that owner base who share that governance with us. Features that I would point out that are noteworthy are a fund manager. So we're Habitat for Humanity. We love the heck out of housing, and I think we knew that our social investor audience knew that and wouldn't trust us. So it's been very helpful, honestly, to have a fund manager to bring some discipline to this. So we are the advocate, and they generally are the voice of prudence in the fund. And that has worked because people do want us involved. Social investors want us involved, but they also want to see that they're applying some sense of risk management to the fund. Another thing I would point out that's noteworthy is a technical assistance facility. Our purpose for this fund is to demonstrate this market. As I mentioned, it's an incredibly nascent market that we're hoping to demonstrate a case for. And so we see this as early stage risk that a nonprofit should take. And to actually propel these opportunities forward, we're also committing to a $10 million technical assistance fund that would go alongside the investment capital. So that $10 million would be used for two purposes. One, to train up local institutions, small-scale cooperatives, microfinance institutions, to help them develop housing products appropriate for their clientele. The other side is to develop housing support services for the households that are on the that are building their homes with the proceeds. And that can look very simple. We're trying to really take some basic engineering and architectural services and make them barefoot, in essence, and try to make those available in communities so that people who are already building their homes on their own with local knowledge, so they can do that better. So I'll leave it at that. I think I'm already over 5. So thanks, Kate.
Well done. Thank you, Patrick. I actually personally think that this work is really excited and needed. And as he said, in the majority of the world, the way that they build prevents them and precludes them from getting traditional financing. That's not the case for affordable housing here in the United States, though. And as we know, the affordable housing industry, with the recession and the foreclosure market and everything that's gone on in the last few years, has changed a lot and has been responding and reacting. And so we're going to have Henry talk a little bit about how they're structuring deals here in the United States to reach the families that need it most. Thanks, Henry.
It's okay if I just put this right here?
Bear with me.
Sure.
We just have a little technical.
Okay. Hi, my name is Henry Lowe, and I work in sort of traditional American affordable housing, particularly in California, though we have done some work across the country. So my work is really developing housing for households that are 60% area median income and below. Usually the targeting includes different levels, like 30, 50, maybe 60%, sometimes 80%, though that most of the housing that I've worked on is much deeper affordable housing. Now, the key sort of theme to developing affordable housing in the United States is really having government programs that create incentives for private players to enter into the market. Because as we've seen from the real estate boom, there was no shortage of players coming into the real estate market to build homes as long as they thought they could achieve an adequate price or rental from that project. Obviously, that has not been the case for affordable housing. There has been a consistent need and lack of affordable housing for people, including up to about 80 or 100% of area median income, particularly in areas like San Francisco, where rental housing in particular is so expensive that even people at the median income have difficulty living in the city affordably. So there are a variety of tools and programs that help create an affordable housing project. And the types of projects I'm talking about are generally multifamily rental projects. So usually at least 20, 30 units, up to 200 or even more units of affordable housing. And it could be a range from family to senior to special needs, disabled populations, or mixes of that. So sort of particularly in my practice, sort of the main incentive is the tax credit program. And that provides investors in these projects with tax credits to offset their tax liability to the federal government, and in certain projects to state federal income liability as well. And then you have a variety of federal government programs, most of them administered by the federal FHA, Federal Housing Authority, or HUD. That FHA has also reabsorbed, I should say, Fannie Mae and Freddie, which I'll chat about a little bit later. Another category that's also related to tax credits are tax-exempt bond financing. This is where the federal government allows the states to allocate certain types of allocate bond loans to projects. And basically the concept behind it is that the interest that the developer pays on those bond loans is not taxable to the bondholder, who is usually some private taxpayer, a bank or a corporation, or it could be individuals who then buy interest in these bonds. And because that interest rate, because the interest payments they receive are not taxable, that means the interest rate on the loan can be lower because they can charge a lower rate. And so that benefit obviously flows through to the developer, which may be a for-profit or a non-profit developer, in the form of a cheaper construction and perhaps permanent loan. The last sort of government program are local and state subsidized loans. And there are many, many programs that sort of exist at this point, and they've sort of, most of them have been thrown up in the air, particularly in California due to our budget crisis. So on the state level in California, we have a state budget crisis that has in the past affected California's ability to issue bonds, which finance a lot of their funding. And it's also flowed through, of course, to the state, to the local county governments. In particular, they've lost funding, and some of that funding is going to affect local local funding for housing, and the elimination of the redevelopment agencies, which were a major source of local funding. In addition to that, those local changes, the financial recession also removed one of the most important players in the American affordable housing market, which is the banks. Again, much of the affordable housing programs rely on private players, whether they're investors or lenders, to jump into the market in order to obtain financial benefit from it. Now, one of those is the tax credits. Now, if you're not making money, you're not paying taxes, and a tax credit isn't of very much use to you. Another component of that is Fannie and Freddie has disappeared from the low-income housing tax credit market. They used to be pseudo-private entities that had profits and that would pay taxes. And they dominated the housing market, both the single-family and the rental market. Fannie and Freddie together made up significant percentages of the investment, not just in the homes that you and I may buy, and our loans may eventually be sold to Fannie and Freddie, and they still are, but they also invested in many of the funds that go out and invest in these affordable housing projects. So my practice involves balancing all the requirements and needs of these various funding sources and making sure that an affordable housing project can actually be constructed and then is financially feasible in the long run so that it can stay affordable and be available to low-income families. Now, in this sort of brave new world in which financing has both fractured because you now have to look for more smaller sources of funding, and in a way it's also condensed or centralized in the sense that HUD and their related programs have become a much more important player in the housing finance because, one, they've expanded many of the programs, and because the alternative state and local programs really just aren't there anymore. The other area that's sort of exciting at this point in the low-income housing project area relates specifically to tax credits. The programs were designed so that in order to obtain these tax credit benefits, the projects had to be affordable for a minimum of 15 years. Now in California, it's generally 55 years. So the California administrator requires 55 years. But the federal law allows you to obtain the tax benefits over 10 years and hold the property for 15. Okay. And then thereafter to find a way to basically re-syndicate or find another source to redevelop those projects.
And that deadline's coming up, right? Yes. It's happening now. So a lot of the affordable housing that was financed 15 or more years ago is now getting restructured all across America. And that's going to have really interesting ramifications. Thank you so much, Henry. So I hope that gave you a sense of what's happening now in the affordable housing here in the United States and how it's changing. I mean, centralizing a lot of that in the federal government is going to be very restrictive for those of us who are doing community development projects at the state and local level. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're working with low-income housing developers. we just heard two people talking about housing, but of course that's not the only element in community development, and a lot of the work that happens in community development is commercial, it's small scale, it's infrastructure. We're going to have Mitch come up and talk a little bit about the work he's been doing in emerging markets in developing banking capacity, which is something that's near and dear to my heart, having worked in Haiti, where we saw banks were sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars of capital, and they were not lending it out. They were not lending it out and investing in their own community. And I'm going to have Mitch talk a little bit about why that may be and what the banks face.
Thank you, Kate. Since Henry took about 10 minutes of my 15-minute presentation, that gives me a little bit more time, and I'm going to go a little fast. What I'm about to talk to you about is what I teach bankers, and it takes me 3 days to teach them. I've got 5 minutes to tell you about it, okay? How many of you have or save money in a bank account? Raise your hand, please. Wonderful. How many of you use a credit union to save money? Raise your hand. How many of you are absolutely delighted with the amount of interest that you're getting paid from the bank? Raise your hand. I want you to keep that in mind when we go and talk about capital and where capital comes from. I'm going to talk a little bit about the risks of capital, because it is this risk, and it is the regulation of risk that is what's making access to capital more difficult today for low-income housing. To give you a little background, I have a private fund. I've actually got 19 private funds, and I'm going to let Dan talk a little bit about an acronym we call Regulation D filings, where I've issued partnerships to do low-income housing over the last 30 years. And the other bank that I'm affiliated with, Shore Bank, which is who I'm here representing today, you may not know Shore Bank is a failed bank. Thank God I work for the advisory side of the organization, and we are now independent of that bank. Why did the bank fail? Because it focused too much of its portfolio on low-income housing. Folks, here's the issue. There are regulations that are now being put in place that are going to make this much, much more difficult, and that's what I'm here to talk about. Where does the money come from, and what are the risks that we have to look for? There's only 3 sources of funds when it comes to financing. My colleagues have mentioned those. It's either coming from the deposits from a bank, it's coming from equity, or it's coming from debt. When we take a look at each of those 3 and look at bank deposits, we have to look at what the bank's commitment to the community is. Banks do have a commitment to put money back into the community. There are 3 basic regulations that deal with that. The first one is the Community Reinvestment Act. It's been around since 1978. However, a more stringent regulation is coming down the pike by December 31st this year. If you're not familiar with it, the Dodd-Frank Act is going to kick in 400 new regulations that are going to impact access to capital. 400 regulations that your bankers and your people who are involved in finance are going to have to interpret and apply, which means it's going to slow down the whole process for you to get access to that capital to build some of those projects. When we take a look at the debt side of this, Henry mentioned it just a minute ago, and that part of that is coming from bonds. With a bond offering, a bond issuance, you have to look at the cost of the issuance. So it's not just the cost of money and what an investor is willing to accept as a rate of return on their bond, but it's the cost of the issuance. Another avenue is what we call a liquidity facility. Henry mentioned something similar to that, where Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac had essentially 44% of the market in low-income housing. That was a mandate from Congress and the White House to increase the amount of access to capital to people who were below the poverty line, or who could not meet traditional mortgage lending standards. And we know what happened there. The problem is that we got a little bit too lax with our underwriting standards. The result was that we have a market that failed. When we take a look at what's coming down the pike, you're going to hear a term called the Basel Accords. Basel is an agreement to set standards for banks around the world. These are lending and capitalization standards so that we are not at risk of financial collapse like we nearly were October of 2008. The Basel Accords, in fact, it was just announced 2 days ago that the U.S. Bankers Association is going to ignore Basel III. They do have to comply with Basel II. One of them has to do with the amount of capital they must keep on hand. when they look at the risks that they have in their portfolios, they have to categorize these risks, and construction loans are one of those risks. Development loans are one of those risks. Low-income housing are one of those risks. The result of that means that there's going to be less access to capital, and we need to be familiar with that. We need to be prepared for that. Essentially what happens is the more a bank gets more aggressive that they get with some of their lending programs, the more capital that they have to put in. That means the stockholders have to put more capital up. How many of you own stock in a bank? One or two. Are you willing to make another contribution? No. Does anybody want to invest in a bank right now? I'm a financial advisor. I would say, don't do it. It is not good practice at this point in time. What's happening is there has to be more aggressive risk mitigants when it comes to construction and low-income housing. Those mitigants mean that we have to do something so we can avoid, as Henry mentioned, a mismatch of tenure. What happens is microfinance and other types of financing have a longer tenure, meaning a longer term, but our deposits and our credit facilities are shorter term. If any of you were here, let's see, I think there's a couple of people here who are as old as I am. Remember 1986 and the collapse of the savings and loan industry. Anybody remember that? That was called rate and deposit mismatch. We made this mistake once before 30 years ago. Let's don't make it again. So we have more restrictive covenants in some of our credit facilities. Again, that's going to mean less access to capital. Let's talk about construction lending, and I know that my 5 minutes is very close to up. I'll go through this really fast. What are we concerned about? Construction lending. We're concerned about the actual management expense that we have, the overhead that we have to manage a credit to a construction loan. One of the issues is the loans that are not approved are those where the developer, the borrower, does not have enough skin in the game, not enough capital at risk. It's in the past years, we allowed the bank to take the risk, or we allowed the government to take the risk. They're pushing back and they're saying, developers, you take more risk. And transactions that are poorly papered. Poorly documented transactions go out my door just like that. I don't have time to look at those because I have a higher quality package. So packaging, technical assistance, very, very critical to get a transaction approved. Borrower defaults. I have $60 million in bad loans and construction loans. Would anybody like to buy any of those? I have land in Arizona. Would anybody like to buy that right now? I'll sell it cheap, because what we did is we got aggressive with our lending standards. We got loose with our lending standards. What happened was that most developers did not have enough capital at risk, and they mismanaged the money that we gave them. Project risks were just incredible. I'm just going to take one more minute. I want to show you some photographs. Contractor competence is a huge issue there. If you can't see there's a balcony and no door. For those of you who are engineers and architects, tell me, will this pass inspection? No, you know it will not. Here's another one. This is a whole building, Shanghai, China. Collapsed. They called me 1 year later as a construction technician, a construction lender, and said, how can you help mitigate risks like this? Are you kidding? Essentially what happened is they allowed a contractor to come in and excavate the building in this area here when the soil was soft, and their engineers on site did not pay attention to what was going on, and that building collapsed. This is why banks have an adverse feeling toward risk, because we've lost money. And whose money is it? How many of you raised your hand a minute ago and said you have money in banks? We're losing your money. Do you like that? No, of course you don't. So that means that what we have to do as lenders is be a bit more conservative and be a little bit more careful, because we're trying to protect your money. Thank you very much.
All right. Take heart, design and construction professionals. Take heart. All right, so next up we have Dan, and he is going to talk about Fundrise. And as I said, I've been around the charity world for a long time. I've been running a nonprofit for 15 years, and everybody comes up to me and they says, "Why don't you use crowdfunding?" And I sort of have to come up with a really polite answer to explain to them that construction projects require a little bit more capital than can generally be generated by most of the crowdfunding systems out there, but not anymore. So I'm very excited to have Dan here.
So I co-founded Fundrise with my brother. We launched the company 2 months ago, and I just want to walk through the platform, then describe our background and how we got here. So we built an online investment platform where anybody can invest directly in local real estate. The first project is a property in 8th Street Northeast. Some of you may know it's an emerging neighborhood in DC, lots of growth. We bought a property in this neighborhood and are now selling a 30% interest in the property to anybody in DC and Virginia. They can invest at $100 a share. And this took, 9 months of working with local regulators, getting it qualified in DC and Virginia. And we started the process about 18 months ago, and in that time, the Jobs Act came. But the concept is basically allowing people to invest in their neighborhood, help create growth, help drive actual returns, and then actually own a piece of the success. This really started with a local real estate development company we had, buying a lot of kind of vacant, underutilized buildings in emerging neighborhoods. As we went out to access capital, there really is not much capital for that type of project, the kind of under $10 million project in an emerging neighborhood. The two traditional sources of capital, one being private equity firms, they really don't touch projects of that size. They have $1 billion fund, they can really only invest in $50 million projects. And when we talk to private equity firms, a $50 million project is huge. 95% of projects are smaller than that, and they just won't fund those. And then the other traditional type of capital is high net worth investors, syndicated capital, 20 or 30 investors each writing a $50,000 check. And what we found is the problem with that type of capital, one, it's very difficult to organize, a lot of management meetings, a lot of back end. But it's also, those investors tend to be in the high net worth neighborhoods. They tend to be in areas that are already have seen the growth. And when we bring them a neighborhood like 8th Street Northeast, they have no intuitive sense of it. They really don't understand what's happening there. They're really not that excited. And their memory of the neighborhood from 20 or 30 years ago is entirely different than what it is today. So that was the business problem we had. Started about 18 months ago. And the concept was, why can't local people invest in the projects? Why can't people who own homes nearby? Why can't people who go out to the neighborhood who really know what's going on, why can't they also invest alongside us in these projects, generate returns, but also help take vacant buildings and create a new place? So we took one of the properties we own, 1351 8th Street. It took about 6 months to find the right lawyer, and then 9 months of working with the local regulators. And we used something called Regulation A, which allows you to do state offerings of under $5 million or less. Very inefficient, very expensive, very slow. But we wanted to test the concept of, are people interested in investing locally, and almost pitch the vision of what if this was possible for other people to do. So the first project was our own project. We launched it 2 months ago. We actually have 302,000 out of 325,000 invested, which we're amazingly surprised by. Last night we had a $10,000 investor who we had never met, invest in the project, and that just really surprises us, but also shows that, one, using real estate as a way to generate wealth. People are willing to write larger checks, which can start to get you to an amount of capital that really makes a project work. And people really have a sense of ownership. When a private equity firm is investing, they are really only investing for financial reasons. That's the only way they measure their success, and that's really all they have to go for. But if you're investing directly, you might care more about the design, you might care more about, is it zero net energy, you might take a lower return for a local coffee shop versus Starbucks. You're investing with values and your capital. So it really changes the type of project you can build. And this one, the restaurant that's opening is called Makedo. It's a very well-known chef in DC is opening a new kind of Asian night market, funky concept. And he has no credit. He's not what banks want to see. He's not what most investors want to see. He's not a Dunkin' Donuts. He doesn't have a huge balance sheet. So it also allows us to do more creative real estate development, and that's really where it all began, trying to do edge urban development, creative development, and finding ways to make that happen. And one of the other things we've done with the platform is just make it a very, very simple checkout process. It almost feels like kind of a jet setter, Gilt, just very easy to purchase. If you actually open these documents, there are hundreds of pages. but it's about making the process very smooth and very easy. And now what we plan to do with the platform is spin it out from our real estate company and allow other developers, other users to use it for themselves. They can post their own projects. They can use it to distribute an email out to their already existing investor pool or gain new investors. We're forming a broker-dealer to help them consult on which different regulations to use to raise the capital. And then we also have a back-end investor management platform which tracks the capital coming in, the capital coming out. And really is a product that we built for ourselves, and we think it's going to be really powerful for people in the future using it as a way to raise capital and do urban development.
So we also, we're missing one panelist here, and I'm just going to mention her and her work. Her name is Maria Angelica Sotomayor, and she's with the World Bank, and I was hoping she could come and talk a little bit about some of the World Bank's investments in Latin America and Caribbean, especially some of the investments they were doing around industrial parks and how they're rethinking industrial parks as more social developments and economic engines. And unfortunately, she couldn't be here today because she is also responding to Hurricane Sandy in the Caribbean. So I hope that you will dive into some World Bank work, which I will hopefully share on our website, and learn more about the work that they're doing in sort of environmental, community-driven industrial developments. It's very exciting work. So with that, I'm going to take questions from the room, and we'll just have a sort of open dialogue here. So if anyone has a question. Sure, in black shirt.
Hi, sorry. I have a question for you, Dan.
If you could say your name and...
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm actually a DC native, so yay. If you wouldn't mind talking a little bit more about pairing the investment in the asset, the real estate asset, with the business, with Makedo, and why you did that, and it's kind of another layer of complexity, and I'm just curious to hear more about that.
Sure. So what she's talking about is when you purchase a share in the LLC, the LLC owns title to the real estate, and we also have a 30% profit share with the tenant. We did that more for two reasons. One, it's going to take them about $1.5 million to open, and we had to step up and provide a good amount of the build-out capital to get them going. So we're putting up $600,000 of the tenant improvements of the hard costs, and then for that are getting the 30% profit share. So that, for us, was we really wanted to jumpstart what we considered a great local restaurateur and his capacity to raise capital. I mean, it's $1.5 million is just a lot of capital to raise. Secondly, we didn't know who the investor was. We didn't know if the investor was going to be kind of a brand investor. They'd be more excited about the new restaurant opening. They wanted to share in that success. Or if it was more financial, I want to own the real estate. We weren't really sure, so we kind of created a combined product that is half, upside of the restaurant, sharing in the tenancy, and then half real estate. And in the future, we may separate it. We're still learning in the process, but a lot of it was we also wanted to help him get started. And for a lot of these local tenants, the landlord really has to help with the gap.
Follow-up question about that to Patrick and Henry and Mitch, whoever wants to step forward. But what I'm noticing is that we're seeing a lot of sectoral investments, right? So I think what's exciting about yours is you get these opportunities to do creative real estate development, but when we're working in large-scale investments with, say, IFC or World Bank or OPIC, often it's just housing, right? So I was wondering if Habitat had a strategy for working on commercial development and for working on these kinds of other business development, economic development inside their microfinance facility.
Yeah. This is on? Yeah. So not MicroBuild. We actually think that we need to keep MicroBuild right now very razor focused on that housing microfinance. We think we're sort of building out a capital markets team for what we do, and we do think actually the next opportunity is going to be sort of the what I call it, sort of the ancillary micro enterprises and small and medium-sized businesses that contribute to the housing sector, which would be just brick factories and things like that. But we think that would have to be a different fund. So.
How about you, Mitch? Are you seeing the World Bank and others? I know Shore Bank consults with a lot of these people. Are they seeing more mixed-use development?
We are actually encouraging it. I spent a couple of years working in Mongolia and Vietnam, And the culture is one where you live where you work. So we try to inspire lending that makes sense. You are lending some to the individual on a commercial basis because, as Patrick mentioned, we already know that the borrower uses about a third of the money for some other use. So we're trying to control that and manage it. And by having them put together a structure which would house, say, a restaurant or their shop along with their living quarters seems to make a lot of sense. And psychologically, there's more buy-in to that. There's more skin in the game. On the other hand, it's very difficult for that to take place here in this country because of the way our mortgage market system is created. We lean toward a pure loan portfolio of housing loans rather than a mix of housing and commercial. So we have a little problem with that here.
So can we take another question from the audience? Woman in the back with the purple shirt? It looks purple. It's very pretty, your shirt.
Thanks. I have another question for Dan.
And if you could introduce yourself, please.
Okay. I'm Sarah Ichioka from the Architecture Foundation in London. Thanks, everybody. Another question for Dan, which is, which criteria will you be using to select the developers who are allowed to use Fundrise?
We're actually still coming up with that, and it's on a project-by-project basis. But as he said, the developer needs to have a certain amount of equity. We're also thinking about doing a Kickstarter style. You have to reach a certain raise. Raising half the money for a project doesn't actually get you anywhere. And then also already having a portfolio of or a group of investors or a stake in the neighborhood. But it's the type of thing where we want people to submit projects and bring them to us, and then we'll talk through the projects and do it case by case.
So you're not thinking about any ethical matrix to judge them, or
we're going to require audits. Any project would have an annual audit. There's a bunch of back end things as well. But we think, we're going to try to eliminate fraud, obviously, but we think the social investing piece, that you're investing in a community, that you're investing with people nearby, also helps kind of self-police it. That if somebody, I don't really think people are going to tend to give money online if it's something they have no idea about, that they really will kind of do the research and get a sense of, have I heard of this person? What's the project? And I think people are capable of doing a basic level due diligence, particularly if it's a project that they can walk by and they can learn about.
Okay, I actually want to, again, follow up on that, but talk to you, Henry, because I think one of the interesting things that was beginning to happen was we were beginning to see platinum level low-income housing, platinum green, and some new standards coming in for energy efficiency and for design standards, actually. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that's being moderated and what the standards are and the criteria are now.
Yeah. Hello? Many of the, particularly the sort of government-run programs for financing, do either have incentives for, energy efficiency design or other design elements that may be particular to the population. Like if you were working on disabled population, if you have certain design elements for physically disabled or certain community-oriented facilities, then those will help you obtain the financing.
It's like a point. It's a point system,
it's
right?
Sort of, yeah, it's a competitive point system, and it's also, if you're working on a project in which you're interested in energy and that kind of efficiency, there are a lot of local programs. For instance, Sonoma has a very widespread and very successful program whereby individuals, including homeowners, can basically, it's actually been under a bit of controversy because the county was a little bit too creative on how it structured it. But basically, they will give you a loan, an interest-free loan, to build, I think it's generally focused on solar panels, and they secure it with a tax lien, which is with a tax assessment on you. And of course, that's upset a lot of lenders because this is basically a lender jumping the priority line. Someone who lent you money and later, and now they're at the front of the line because it's a tax lien. Tax liens come before loans in priority. So it's definitely worth looking at the local area and seeing what incentives and programs they have for the type of project you may be entering into.
Dan, would you build those kinds of incentives for sustainable design into the platform at some point? Would you consider that?
I mean, we definitely think so. We think environmentally friendly design, high quality design, those are things we're going to try to encourage. But we're still early on. We're trying to figure out the best way, and we want to keep it, less restrictive. But we think that as people are going to be investing on more values, that the business that's in the building, the type of design, the energy efficiency, that'll start to matter more than it currently does in real estate.
And have any of you considered using the LEED platform in the work that you're doing? Maybe Mitch, you can talk about that as a standard, as a criteria for making investment choices.
Indeed, Mongolia has a particular problem where about 45% of their housing is in a structure called a ger. The ger's outer skin, if you will, is nothing but a felt fabric. And so there is a huge loss of energy there, a huge loss of heat. It gets, in the wintertime, it's about 40 below there. That was difficult for me to get adjusted to, being from Arizona. So what we were trying to do is look at energy efficiency items, and we actually came up with a financing program to provide high efficiency pellet stoves to heat these gers, and this program actually worked very well.
And has anyone used LEED criteria in their projects at this point as a requirement?
I haven't seen it as a requirement. There are definitely certain, for instance, there's an organization called Enterprise, and they do a variety of programs, and they are very active in community and green-oriented programs. And they have a variety of programs that are designed for green retrofitting. I do have one group, Link Housing in Southern California, and they're very, very focused on developing affordable housing to LEED Platinum standards. I think they have one project. But even with the peculiar incentives in the low-income housing tax credit area, it's still very expensive to move. The trade-offs. I mean, I don't personally know them, and I haven't calculated them, but I think it's still you still have to pay. You have to pay extra. I think on an economic level, it's still hard to reach that. On the platinum level, unless you're willing to sacrifice some of the financial gain.
More questions in the front, in the gray sweater.
You might have to repeat it if you can't hear it, but I was trying to.
Can you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, I'm Lauren. I'm Lauren Roth-Benu. I live in Honolulu. I own an ecological design firm. My question, I guess, would be to anyone who could answer this. But one of the problems that I'm seeing faced with both homeowners and commercial projects that want to go after, something even above LEED, like the Living Building Challenge, especially a homeowner who's actually my neighbor who's wanting to do this for his home. He's unable to get the loans from the bank because there's not any comparables. It's one thing to talk about putting on solar panels, and that's sort of now become well known, but there's this huge gap with all these other innovative ways to do sustainable development, and the loans are not as easily he's not as easily able to obtain them. So I was just wondering if you guys had any ideas or advice on how to close that gap so that more of these innovative projects can happen.
Mitch, you want to take that one?
Retrain bankers. We've seen this issue in other cultures and other countries where we've had to take a new product where there are no comparables for them and train the banker on how to value that by tracking the loans that they make. And you start off with a smaller portfolio, a designation of how many dollars or whatever the currency unit is for that country, and say, all right, we're going to put this at risk for this project, now track it. And that only takes time for it to grow before you build a database where you could make some comparables inside the bank. And we actually did that in 2 banks in Mongolia. It's worked successfully, although it's still nascent. They're still getting going on it, but so far so good. Otherwise, I'll be back there.
Retraining bankers in America might take a little longer. I don't know. I'm just guessing. I don't know. Well, we're going to take one or two more questions. Yes, the silver hair and beautiful black sweater.
This is for Dan.
If you could introduce yourself, please.
My name is Carlisle Seckham from North Star Construction in Carmel. And my question to Dan is, I'm not really understanding, is it like stock when you invest, something in your company? Where do you get you don't have your name on the title. That's always the big thing when you're investing in real estate. You have your name on the title. So you don't have your name on the title. So is the value of the property increased, then you're able to sell it and get a higher return? I mean, where is it for the customer?
So I think what you're asking is, one, what is the structure of this financing deal, and two, what's the exit strategy?
Yeah.
So the property is
for
owned
the small investor,
The property is owned by an LLC, and we have the manager of the LLC, so we have the governance and control rights. But on an economic basis, you're buying units in the LLC. Each dollar is a certain percentage unit, and you're side by side our capital. So you're owning a piece of the LLC as if you buy, somewhat similar to buying a public company. You own a portion of the company, and you get a portion of their profits and cash flow. And the return is built from three components. The tenant is paying $150,000 of rent a year, which is basically kind of a cash flow yield. I think I should know it around 7 or 8%. Then there's 30% profit share that the LLC gets from the tenant, which the SEC wouldn't let us estimate. We had to estimate that at 0, but I think it's probably going to be more than that. And then the third is appreciation, long-term growth. If we re-rented the building in 10 years, it would probably be, I think rents might be higher. So that's the return. And then on exit strategy, you're able to sell your shares to another investor if you get manager sign-off. We're looking at partnering with a couple groups to create a secondary market. By having a widely held LLC interest, you should be able to have maybe some more liquidity than normal in real estate. But that's probably the most common question: how do I exit? And for now, the answer is it's a kind of a long-term cash flow investment. You can sell it to someone else if you'd like, and then when we sell the building, it would be liquidated, and you would get your percentage portion.
So, Patrick, actually, when you look at microfinance, that's a question that comes up because these are loans that are uncollateralized, and it's not really so much the exit strategy, but what's the strategy for homeowners to gain equity when it's a microfinance loan and you're not using the collateral and you don't have foreclosure and you don't have a market assessment of the value of the property?
So there is a phenomena that we've seen whereby I've seen this myself in Tanzania, actually. People actually can gain higher degrees of land rights by showing that they're actually making improvements and building on it. So we have, for a number of people, this kind of progressive building strategy can actually lend towards them having a greater claim towards that property, and then eventually having it be sort of a full asset that they can liquidate. So that's actually quite common for us to see in a lot of developing countries. But that's one way to think about that.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time, but that doesn't mean that you guys can't keep carrying on the conversation. So all of these panelists are going to join us. We have some tables set up in the back here, and they'll be available to talk with you one-on-one about all of your construction financing, real estate development questions. So please join us in the back. And thank you so much to our panelists. That was an amazing panel. Thank you. Thank you.